Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's joined in. Let me start by referring to last week's events in Mali, in particular in the Malian security sector. The Economist labeled it as a coup that was coming. It shows us how political dynamics and political economy dynamics need to be central to our assessments of security sector governance. And if we don't include these realities into our analyses and into our project designs, we are setting ourselves up for possible failure. But we all know that this is sensitive stuff for all involved, for host countries, for international organizations, for donors, for implementing partners. And so it's good to discuss how to move forward on these topics. My name is Daniel Prince. I'm heading currently the SSR team in the United Nations Department for Peace Operations. And we organized this webinar with Bernard Harborn's team at the World Bank. So Bernard, thank you for partnering with us on this. We have many people tuning in from all over the world, and we have a 1 hour only segment to discuss our important topics. We do that with 4 panelists and 2 discussants. The panelists obviously will kick off the conversation, and then later I will engage the discussants. And others who have joined us through YouTube can submit questions or remarks, and a few of which we aim to tackle at the end. And Bernard will then wrap up our conversation. So let me quickly, just very shortly, introduce the panelists that we have with us. It's Mr. Khalid Medani, the chair of the African Studies program at McGill University in Montreal. It's Yazid Sayir, senior fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. It's Niagale Bagayoko, the chair of the African Security Sector Network based in France, and Mr. Erwin van Veen, senior research fellow at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendaal in The Hague. A wonderful panel, and we are excited to have this conversation with all of you. So welcome to you as well. We try to do this in 4 main segments. First, our conversation, and each of these segments will take about 10 minutes, and each of them will sort of be guided by a question. I'll pose the question to one of the panelists. The panelist will reply only for 3-4 minutes, and then other panelists will jump in for an even shorter period of time, so that after a 10-minute conversation on a topic, we can move to the next one. That's a bit the way we try to structure this. Of course, we'll be flexible on it, but in the end, we'll need to fit it all into a 1 hour segment. Without further ado, let's just start this and move to issue 1 that I'll particularly aim at Khalid. Khalid, the question here is, why is it so important for international development and peace-building practitioners to grasp the political economy, the politics, and the power relations in the security sector? Over to you.
I want to thank all my colleagues on the panel and thank the United Nations folks in the World Bank as well. It's difficult for an academic to limit oneself to just 3 minutes, but I'm going to try to speak very fast, or at least highlight some important points. I think it's kind of an honor to be asked this question as an academic. And the first kind of intervention I would make is that the importance of understanding the political economy, politics, and power issues associated with the security sector is a question that I believe academics, frankly, have already come to terms with. And so what I want to do is that just highlight conceptually why that is important for practitioners and development actors to take into account, but also empirically using the case of the Sudan. Conceptually, and as you probably know, most everyone here knows, is aware that the notion of the deep state or the parallel state or the weak state in Africa, Middle East, other regions has already really defined and made very clear the very close connection between the bureaucracy, political actors, and the security sector. So it's a question that if you ask an academic, they would be a little bit surprised, because the literature, of course, is there and it's very comprehensive. There are, of course, variations. A deep state is a concept that travels differently and has different meanings in different regions. In the case of the African continent, and particularly the Horn of Africa, I would really label this nexus between the security, political establishment, and the bureaucracy as a parallel state, or as a weak state. I think that that would be very, very useful for us. And so I think that we kind of have to begin with this kind of provocative, maybe a truism, but that the security sector is the political sector, and the political sector is the security sector. You know, that is something that's very, very important to keep in mind. We can refine our understanding of the deep state in these contexts or parallel state in our discussion, which is really important. But I wanted to be very clear about the consequences of this by highlighting Sudan very quickly, and maybe mentioning just a few points that I think are very, very important for development practitioners to understand with respect to why they need to understand this connection. And I want to begin with the Sudanese revolution of late 2018 and 2019 that really caught the attention of the world. But there was a law that was passed following the revolution that is rarely mentioned, but is known to all of the Sudanese. And I think it really hits home with respect to the importance of understanding the politicization of the security sector. It was a law in December 2019, following the revolution and assumption of the new civilian military coalition government, entitled the Law Dismantling the Regime of 30th June 1989. The reason I emphasize this law is this law was met with great celebration among all of the Sudanese activists who waged the revolution and all civil society actors. The law, in addition to dismantling the public order law that policed and regulated the behavior of women, was very specific about dismantling the institutions, not just the previous government, but the institutions of the security state in Sudan that was built up in the past 3 decades. And the reason I want to highlight this is because one of the things that we don't really always focus on is that a deep state can only exist where citizens are unable to express their voice, where they're unable to practice civil liberties, where there is no promise for democratic elections. So here I want to tie the democratic aspirations of the revolution in Sudan to their own call implemented and promulgated by this law to dismantle the security sector that had, of course, underpinned the authoritarian regime in Sudan. So I would really encourage practitioners to look at this law and its origins, the international practitioners and development, to understand the kind of political will associated with the dismantling of a security sector that has overwhelmed the aspirations and freedoms, really, of civil society and the Sudanese. So I want to just highlight just a few points. I'm sorry I'm going a little bit long, with respect to directly why understanding this nexus between the security sector and politics for development practitioners is key. Number one, I'm going to do it via bullet points a bit. Number one, there can be no entry point for economic development or economic policies absent a real understanding of the politics of the security sector, because the relationship between this sector, the security sector, and the private sector, and even the public sector in these kind of states is intermeshed. I can give you examples of Sudan. There, of course, Dr. Saya will give you many examples of Egypt. So there is no sustainable, effective interventions in terms of economic growth and development absent this understanding. The second point is that there's no entry for human rights work. and no really effective, sustainable promotion of civil society and democracy or democratic transition, which of course is a normative aspiration, but for many of us, that's a really very important concern. The reason for that is obvious, of course, and that is the relationship between the security sector, let's say in the Sudan or in Mali or Somalia, that is the paramilitary militias that are part and parcel of the parallel state, are directly linked to human rights violations in places like Darfur or Eastern Sudan or the southern regions of the three conflict areas in the country. A third element is that is not often highlighted, but has been emphasized by the Sudanese activists who waged the revolution, the Sudanese people, and that is that there can be no strong national defense, no strong national army. One of the things about these parallel states or deep states in the context of the Horn of Africa in particular is that they are directly linked to a weakened national army. Without a strong, autonomous, institutionalized, and legitimate national army, which is what the Sudanese are working towards at the moment, there can be no security around the borders and no peace across the borders, which is such an important aspect of international security and regional security issues. The number 4, there can be no effective peace building, I believe, and I think it's quite obvious, and practitioners, I think, would know this even more than I can represent here, because the way that militias, paramilitary militias operate. Put very simply, there are 2 elements that I think you are aware of. Number 1, paramilitary militias mobilize ethnic ties and foment ethnic conflict in order, of course, to gain and defeat their rivals, let's say as in the case in Darfur, which is happening currently. Another element that I've done research on, and I think it's obvious to most, and that is that there is no way to deal with stopping the wave of recruitment of young people into paramilitary militias if one does not understand the relationship between the security sector and local politics. That becomes a really, really important aspect. Finally, there can be no, and I want to, I have much more to say, but I want to emphasize, maybe in conclusion, that for those interested in democratic transition, here you will note that I'm returning to how one can actually deal with the problems associated with the deep state. There can be no transition to democracy absent an understanding of the securitization of governance structures. In the case of Sudan, for example, in the previous decades, local governors, just a very important empirical example, were and continue to be appointed by the military establishment, and even more important in Sudan, by the security services. That becomes a really important aspect to keep in mind. And I want to highlight for those really interested in delving into these themes much more closely, using Sudan as a case, to look at what is happening with respect to the negotiations, the historical negotiations in Juba at the moment associated with security arrangements. If you look closely at the protocols associated with the ongoing historic security arrangements being brokered by civilian military leaders and armed insurgent leaders, you will see that all of these things that I mentioned are part and parcel of the protocols. Encapsulated into one, practitioners must understand the root causes of these conflicts and the historical aspect, and that is an empirical question, of course, which is very, very important. These issues have to also be inclusive. Security arrangements have to be brokered through an inclusive dialogue, and this is what is ongoing, at least on paper, in the Sudanese case, which I think is extremely important. And here is where the development practitioners can really make a very, very important contribution, I believe, in looking at the root causes, helping with the inclusivity of it, and finally, understanding that these talks are just one part, one step into a sustainable, peaceful transition to democracy. The talks now hinge, and their sustainability hinge on whether they will eventually be ratified through a constitutional conference and an elected government of the Sudanese people that ratifies these security arrangements, that gives them legitimacy in order to sustain them. Taken all together, absent this kind of knowledge, I don't think that interventions by peacekeepers or international actors, whether it is the United Nations agencies or other external actors, will be successful. And I think, unfortunately, we have seen many cases of this kind of failure in the case of Sudan and in the Horn in general. So I'm going to stop there. I apologize for going on too long.
Thank you, Khalid. Fascinating stuff. Yes, slightly too long, but that, you know, it's good to have a kickoff that everyone sort of, you know, relates to. Let me check just with other panel members if there's any immediate remarks that you would wish to have, or questions or insights from your side. Yazid or Niagale or Erwin. Go ahead.
Okay, no, just to say that I will react just after, but the notion of a parallel state or a deep state have a lot to do with what I will talk about, which is hybrid security governance. Thank you.
Very nice, and very good to sort of, yeah, approach the issue of a parallel state through saying it may exist, but on the other hand, you know, it is in practice. In practice, it is very much part of what the state is about at that moment. And so it forces us to take into account what's happening there and what the dynamics are. So thank you, Khalid, for the moment. I'm sure we come back to these themes all the time. Let's move to Yazid. Yazid will cover a second issue, which is basically as follows. When national security actors deploy rent-seeking strategies. As we know, rent-seeking is about accruing wealth without benefits for others, basically. When they do that, how does that affect the United Nations and World Bank interventions and those of others in the field of sustaining peace? Yazid?
Thanks. I'm going to jump straight in and say first that I draw my remarks from the experience of Arab countries. And secondly, that I'm going to focus on the term in the question, which is rent-seeking strategies, rather than black market or other illegal economic activities, bureaucratic corruption, etc., even though there may be significant overlap between rent-seeking and these other forms of, you know, bluntly illegal activities. And that's because use of the term strategy implies an activity that is both sustained and that reproduces itself over time or adapts to changing circumstances, such as, for instance, reforms or programs that are maybe brought in by the government or by external partners. And so rent seekers tend to adapt to these rather than sort of give up or disappear entirely. Secondly, the other broad takeaway I want to offer, and I'm going to leave my case studies till later for the discussion if I run out of time, that rent seeking, in the manner I'm describing it, derives its principal opportunities and its principal resources from the formal structures and frameworks, legal and otherwise, of the state or that are provided by the state. In other words, rent seeking isn't something that happens, you know, cross-border smuggling, black market activities exclusively. Rather, the most important rent seeking is the kind of activity that takes place at the expense of state resources or national resources, and that is enabled by legal, administrative, and other systems of the state. Even if then the actual accessing of resources is conducted informally or even illegally. Third, that despite similarities between the national armed forces, the military, on the one side, and police and other law enforcement or internal security agencies that normally come under ministries of interior on the other side, although there's a lot of similarity between the two, in fact, they're very different in terms of a lot of things. Their legal basis, one is purely military, the other has a civilian character. They come under different legal codes and systems, but they also have different relationships to coercive power and to rent seeking. And so it's my argument here, and my focus is on the military, because I think that they are the more significant rent seeker. They're better able to position themselves to tap into the major sources of rent in many countries, certainly in the Middle East and North Africa region. And so in most cases where we do find that police and internal security actors are getting involved in various forms of rent seeking, this tends towards black market activity, corruption, bribery, and where they become more major rent seekers is usually in a context of state breakdown. You can think of Libya, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere, where they become militarized and in a sense are military actors and not purely any more police actors. Now, the key takeaway I want to offer is that in the most prominent cases in Arab countries of rent-seeking strategies by military actors, the armed forces, these strategies, I think this is predictable, closely reflect and replicate the wider political economy of the country. In other words, the military do what other actors do in the system. They may do it on a smaller scale or a larger scale, but looking at what the military do in the way of rent seeking or of economic activity, whether formal or informal, gives us a very good analytical prism or lens through which to view and understand how business is done in the wider political economy of the country, regardless of whether it's a state capitalist system such as that of Egypt or a more private sector-based system. And so the sort of subsidiary point here is that the actual volume or value in absolute terms of military rent seeking or of military economic and commercial activity may in fact represent a small percentage of GDP, of gross domestic product. So in absolute terms, it might seem insignificant, 1%, 2% of total value, for instance, depending on the methodology we use to estimate value. Generally speaking, my argument is based on, for instance, my major report last year on the Egyptian military economy, is that the actual percentage is small. However, that is not to say it's not insignificant, not because of the military's focus, or not only because the military tends to focus on some of the most lucrative rent-seeking streams or rent streams. So, for instance, in Algeria, hydrocarbons are one area where the military have strong informal presence, or similar sectors in Egypt, not hydrocarbon, but in certain sectors of manufacturing, access to land and land use, real estate and construction, areas where they have formal presence. These are areas where a lot of value added to the economy concentrates. And so the military tends to focus on those areas where they can derive the most rent income. But having said that, what's most important is that the military end up with a vested stake in the current economic system or in the current political economy. In other words, they want to maintain the system. They will resist change, whether this is legal, administrative, bureaucratic, or economic. And because the military are the most powerful coercive agencies, certainly in a country like Algeria, Egypt, Syria, but in most countries, in fact, that also means that their resistance to change is much greater than their actual share of the economy. And the final point I want to make here among my main analytical takeaways is that military rent seeking is likely to intensify rather than to diminish in countries that face major socioeconomic challenges and public financial deficits. This is especially true already in countries pre-COVID pandemic and is becoming even more true with the COVID impacts. So a country like Algeria, which was basing its budget just months ago on a price of around $157 per barrel of oil that it exports, and on which it relies almost entirely for its budget. Oil is now around $40 per barrel. Now, in the Algerian case, this means that the military, rather than withdraw from its influence over government and over policy, will likely intensify its grip precisely because it's trying to protect its share of a diminishing pie. The same is true, I believe, in Egypt, where debt is rising, where poverty is rising dramatically, and so on. So the takeaway then at the end here is, once again, that what goes on in the military economy is a faithful replica of what goes on in the wider economy. Reforms that aim at changing crony economics or rent seeking in the wider economy will probably fail for all sorts of reasons, but one is that if they fail to take into account the military share and stake in the system and the immense political power it can bring to bear, even when its actual financial power is much less. I'll stop there in order to allow for discussion of case studies later on.
Thank you very much, Yazid. Fascinating insight again into the realities of, what in the end is also about possibilities of assistance and cooperation, and the difficulty of entering there if we take into account everything that needs to be taken into account. Thank you. Let's open up the floor if possible, or if there is immediate reactions from other panelists. Again, yes, Khalid, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sayed. It's just fascinating, especially kind of your understanding of how the military manipulates the legal mechanisms in order to naturalize this rent-seeking strategies, which I think is just absolutely important. It's why we have to be careful, I think, about overstretching the concept of a deep state or a shadow state. So I think that your contribution, of course, I'm familiar with your work as well. The one issue I wanted to ask is issues of relative autonomy with respect to external actors. This is not only important for the Middle East region, but it is important also for the Horn of Africa and other African countries. One element that I wanted to ask you to expand on is really the relationship between these rent strategies and geopolitics. I think in the case of the Horn of Africa, maybe I didn't emphasize enough, we use these terms to simplify matters in these kind of discussions, but without understanding the role of the Middle East or the role of Ethiopia or the role of Chad, Libya, it's very difficult to come to terms with these rent-seeking strategies. So in your work, and what is your understanding? Are we talking about some countries like Egypt who have more relative autonomy with respect to the military and their rent-seeking strategies as opposed to other neighboring countries? Or where does the role of these, what we call strategic rents, the external relationships of the countries, because the Middle East is, in particular, the Middle East and North Africa has a particular kind of role to play in that respect. So if you could just elaborate on that for us a bit.
Yazid.
Excellent question, and an important corrective of or a correction to my approach. Certainly, the geopolitical context is extremely important in multiple ways, not just one. In some cases, such as Egypt or arguably Lebanon or Tunisia, in very different ways, Western security assistance is extremely important. And can represent something like anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of domestic spending on the military. But more important, I think, and Egypt is the prime case of this, is that I'll be blunt, totally blunt, given our audience. Egypt has a very large military economy. It's unique among the Arab states in having not only an extremely extensive military economy that is not a defense industry alone, but rather is a massive involvement in the delivery of civilian goods and services, all done formally under laws that are issued by a parliament or the government or by the president mostly, that empower and enable a large array of military agencies to set up commercial companies to compete in markets directly with the private sector while competing for public sector contracts, which they get on a non-competitive no-bid basis. Now, that is an example. Almost everything that happens in the military economy in Egypt, and frankly, in a large part of the economy generally, is rent-seeking. It establishes what I think of as an extractive relationship between these powerful state institutions, principally the army, but also interior minister and others, which are given the primary access to public contracts and procurement in a system which the International Monetary Fund has demanded be standardized into a single procurement law, and which, after dispersing nearly $14 or $15 billion to Egypt in the last 4 years, has still not happened and will not happen. And this is the answer to your question, Dr. Madani, that basically Western governments, international financial institutions, and multilaterals, EU bodies, etc., place a much greater premium on the geopolitical relationship with Egypt than they do on all their talk about genuine economic market reforms. The private sector in Egypt is squeezed, it's marginalized, it has no say in policy. This is a state command economy, despite all the talk about privatization and all the rosy talk from international institutions. And if you read hardly between the lines of, say, the International Monetary Fund's reports on Egypt in the last 2 years alone, you'll see that they're basically saying Egypt is not actually delivering on several key things that would start to transform the entirety of this rentier system, including its military component, which once, finally, the IMF referred to about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, once, which is amazing, although never since.
Thank you very much, and we'll come back to these topics. Thanks. Let's move for the moment then now to issue 3. Again, it interlocks with the other topics that we've already discussed, and this is one in particular for Niagale. The question is, how does a lack of understanding of the political economy and politics of security in a country, how does that lack of understanding affect the success of programs on security sector governance? Niagale?
Okay, thank you. I think it is first important to focus on the challenges. The first one, according to me, is that security sector reform policies conducted on the African continent by international partners tend to focus mostly on state institutions, governmental, established stakeholders, legal framework, etc., or codified standards. And in fact, most of the SSR processes are more often than not concentrated on the formal arrangement of the states and security institutions, even if there are, of course, some programs who try to engage civil society organization or the media, but it's not at all central in the global approach of the global international approach to SSR. And I think that such approaches are in fact fundamentally at variance with the underlying realities of the African context, where many political and social transactions, not least in the security sector, take place in the context of informal norms and systems, and where a wide range of institutions operate alongside or within nominally formal political institutions. And I think that this may well account for many of the limitations of efforts to reform the security sectors and its governance systems. Of course, controlling the state dimension of security remains essential, but the way we do understand the states is in fact at stake, I think. And of course, I fully agree with Professor Madani to say that the notion of parallel states, the deep states, in French, sorry, I'm French, but I cannot remember, you know, all Jean-François Bayard works on La politique du ventre have a lot to do in the way the state itself should be understood and approached. Because in fact, the complexity of Africa's socio-political and security dynamics call inseparably also for a deep understanding of societal realities, often informal, within which security governance is rooted. And the reversal and failures in SSR processes in many African countries, as well as crises involving security forces, demonstrates the need to much better understand the societal, cultural context within which they do occur. I think it is the other very important aspect. There is, so first, a need to better understand the way the state is working, but also to better understand the societal and the cultural context in a number of countries. What is important to say is that there is no, on one side, formal arrangement and on the other side, informal systems. The reality in many African countries is that formal and informal systems tend to overlap, to interrelate, and to interpenetrate each other at complex level. And state and informal networks, in fact, are not mutually exclusive, but they should rather be seen as embedded in each other. And I definitely think that today there is an insufficient empirical understanding of the complex interplay between formal and informal institutions, which determine how policies play out on the ground and impact or not the lives of citizens. And I will just take a number of examples which are taken from different countries in making researches or trying to implement some programs. For instance, we all know that African states rely formally on national armed and security forces, but as was just said, it is also very important to look at the indirect strategies in building alliance with elites at the local level, taking into account traditional standards and authority, as well as customary justice, or by shrinking tacit agreements with security forces, including militias installed by a rural or urban communities, as was just said by my two fellows. It is also very important to look at those shadow mechanisms within the state itself. For instance, what I would call the fatherhood mechanisms, which are informal recruitment and promotion processes, parallel chains of commands, artificial volume of the workforce, the political economy of military camps, for instance, sale of rice, sale of fuel on the black market, or alternative resources such as bribery, but also the securitization of mine sites, for instance, in countries like Guinea. And I do agree that there is a need to differentiate the rent-seeking practices in the military and the police forces, but sorry, I have no time to develop, so I'm making a mix. There is also the power structuration, which is very important, and micropolitics and power relations around resources within military and security apparatuses themselves. And from this aspect, I think we should pay attention or repay attention to the so-called civil-military approach, which in fact have been put aside at the benefits of the SSR approach, which was much more comprehensive, much more interagencies, etc. But there are a lot to be criticized in the civil-military relations approach, but something which is very interesting is that it is based on a power relations analysis. And this is something we should be back to pay attention to. It is also very important to look at the different historical relations. Yazid talked about the importance of the historical background. I agree. No, it was Medani, sorry, but I definitely think that understanding the relations, for instance, of between inside communities themselves. We saw, for instance, in Mali, how important it was. It's not enough to say, yes, there is a need to integrate much more Tuareg in the military or to integrate much more Fulanis, because in fact, themselves are characterized by internal, very complex relationships, which are based on superiority and hierarchical relations, and they do matters. For instance, when it is coming to DDR. We saw that between, for instance, Iforas and Imrad in Mali. I will be very quick because I think we are running out of time. But I think that we at ISSN, we consider that the concept of hybrid security can be very useful and relevant to approach and understand all those dynamics, and also to help decision makers to integrate much more those perspectives, because they explain the difficulties they can experience on a daily basis. It is no more possible, I think, to pretend that all those systems are functioning as Weberian rational states, which is in fact the hypothesis behind all the SSR programs we're all promoting today. I think that, for instance, there is a need to identify empirically which hybrid processes, on the one hand, foster inclusion and accountability, and which, on the other hand, reinforce exclusion and violence and impede the emergence of democratic security governance. I think the hybrid security approach can also help to provide a better understanding on how, and for one, oversight mechanisms work in situations where parallel chains of commands or parallel channels of influence actually determines the allocation of resources and security provision. I think such a perspective should also be integrated in program design, for instance, in human resources policies, in legal frameworks, and also I think, just to finish, they could help in the design of oversight as well as monitoring and evaluation process. Because I think this point is absolutely key, because I am growingly convinced that there is a real problem with the M&E approach, which is presently used and promoted. I think that most of the indicators which are used today are absolutely out of the real pictures. So I think that formalizing indicators, taking into account informality or hybridity, would really help in having much more impact on the ground. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Galé, thank you very much. Really fascinating stuff, and it shows how your emphasis on, the interaction and the interrelation between the formal and the informal also connects so closely to what Khalid said about, maybe we shouldn't focus too much on a parallel state, but to acknowledge that, whatever happens sort of outside of the formal is also part of what the state does. Anyway, thank you for that. Let me quickly see if there's any immediate reactions from the three other panelists. If so, go ahead.
I wouldn't mind chipping in a few thoughts, Danielle, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Erwin.
Thank you so much. Well, wonderful. First of all, thank you for your warm welcome at the beginning, and thanks to Bernard as well. And then, of course, to the previous intervenants for their exposing and sharing their thoughts so elegantly. One very brief point to pick up on what Niagala just made, I think, in terms of highlighting the overly state-centric focus of much SSR work. I think this coincides with a lot of programs that are, better labeled train, build, and equip type programs, right? Classic military-to-military cooperation that is then often billed as security sector reform. They explain a large part of the failure in my reading, and this is mostly because they tend to be programs that are essentially outsourced, state-centric, in pursuit of foreign security interests, and not so much reflective of local and citizen security needs of the places where they are put in action. And apart from the conceptual problem, or the moral problem even, that this entails, there is also a big issue here that such programs tend to build heavily on very enthusiastic assumptions on both the neutrality and the intention and the capability of the state. So in other words, circling back to a point that a number of people have already made in the call today, the state is not typically the sort of neutral actor that advances citizen interests in many of the places that we look at, but either suffers from partisan capture or is subject to certain political dynamics that need to be taken into account. And if you do not do this, you will likely end up strengthening the existing power structures or simply being irrelevant. And I think these are important dimensions to take into account from a very practical point of view. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erwin. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see if there's any others or Niagala to further this point just for 1 minute. And it's not needed, but it can be done.
Yes, I fully agree that the train and equip approach has a lot to do with this state-centric focus of international programs. But as we can see, I think that from this prospect, the case of Mali is more than interesting, because we saw that there has been a massive investment in training and providing equipment to the security forces, especially to the military. And what we can see today is that we now have military actors who have been highly reinforced. The situation has nothing to do, in my view, with the 2012 situation, where the military was poorly equipped, poorly trained. Today, you have very strengthened units within the military, who could in fact come and compete one to each other because of the political ambitions of some of them, or yes, because of the will to some of them to have access to the rent and to the resources. So I think it's a key point.
Very good example. Thank you. Yes, we're forced to move on. It's a bit unnatural, but that's how it is. We all have to cram this within a 1 hour period. And so that's why we move to our first and final question, after which our two discussants will also get the floor. But so this is actually for Erwin, our last issue. It's about stronger analysis of the political economy of the security sector. How will a stronger analysis lead to better engagement by the UN, by international financial institutions, and by development partners? Erwin?
Thank you so much again. I mean, I will be concise. I think there are two preliminary issues to consider. One is, of course, how much analysis is sufficient. And to this, there is no straightforward answer, but we know the characteristics of the type of analysis that is required. Long-term, say 3 or 4 years of analytical ongoing work will create the movie instead of the image. You will need a local international partnership, research organization-wise. And also you need a linkage, of course, between the policy and the analysis, because you can produce really good analysis, but if there is no link with the people who try to program or serve in a peacekeeping operation or something like that with sufficient time to make good use of it, we're not going to see any impact. The second preliminary point is that, of course, good analysis is no guarantor of success. In other words, there will always be major issues of high politics and power, like in Mali, as you started the call with, that will intervene in even the best run program that benefits from the best possible analysis. So the challenge for the analysis is to try to monitor this and for a program to be able to go into deep freeze for a while or mothball if there are these ruptures, right, that so often occur, and then restart afterwards instead of, cutting all ties and losing all the capital and the investment made. So having said that, without further ado, why would better political economy analysis lead to, or could lead to, better security sector reform? Well, first of all, I will make 4 points here very quickly. One is that it helps you understand the conflict frame. Right? Take an example, Iraq at the moment, there is a lot to do about the different armed groups that run around the country that are or are not under the purview of the government. Many of these have ties to Iran. They are obviously not going to be disarmed or play ball without resolution of the broader Iranian-US tensions. So this fundamentally limits the possibilities for security sector reform in Iran at the moment. And if you do not understand these linkages and the allegiances of these groups
in Iraq.
In Iraq, exactly. Yeah, to Iran. The links are to Iran, of course. You won't be an effective. You won't have an effective program. Second, if you understand the power dynamics within the security sector and how deeply entrenched they are, what the deep state looks like, what that rent-seeking behavior that was spoken about before looks like, you're going to be able to determine the level of political effort that you will need to put into any change management process connected to security sector reform. So concretely, how much time is the UN Special Representative going to have to input into an SSR program or initiative will very much depend on the quality of the relations and the structure of the power interests, for example. Then thirdly, of course, these insights are necessary for good programs, right? That make sense, that are feasible. And to give an example, again, from Iraq, the fight against the Islamic State, a number of Western countries started pouring resources into the Kurdish Peshmerga. Now, that was very effective in combating the Islamic State, but did not go hand in hand with any understanding of the very deep divisions within the Peshmerga and their different party political functions, with the consequences that we face today, right now that the fight against the Islamic State is over. So these sort of insights are necessary, I think, to develop a responsible program, in this case, around training and equipping such forces. And then the very final point that I would make here is, if you do not understand the political economy of a particular conflict situation, a particular national context, you cannot hope to have realistic policies to address the main SSR challenges in these places. And take the case of Libya. There is a civil war going on at the moment, so there is no space for security sector reform. But nevertheless, all indicators point to the need for a decentralized model of security provision in the near to medium term future that benefits maybe from a central backstop, but needs to respect the geographical diversity of Libya and the different factions that hold sway at the moment. So that variation needs to be respected, and at the same time you will need to co-opt certain elements of the Libyan security elite, in part warlords. You need to understand who they are, what their interests are, what may induce them to collaborate with any security sector reform efforts, and translate that into a policy that can actually guide your program set on the ground. So that's what I would say to this topic, and thanks again for the time to elaborate on these issues.
Erwin, thank you very much. Very nice to have, in only a few minutes, quite an extensive overview of what's needed in these fields. I actually would want to go straight away to the discussants to include them in our conversation. There's two of them, Hans Born, Assistant Director and Head of Policy and Research Division at DCAF in Geneva, and Alex Berg, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University and a USIP fellow. Can I start with Hans? After you've heard, our 4, let's say, presentations and this conversation, what are your sort of immediate thoughts? Hans, over to you.
Oh, Daniel, can you hear me? Everything? Yes. So first of all, you, Daniel, thank you, and your colleagues at the UN, and also our friends at the World Bank. Many thanks for inviting me to comment on these very rich presentations, which were extremely insightful, and it gave me a few thoughts based on our own work at DCAF. Now, first of all, the list of financial mismanagement, financial unsustainable practices, financial crimes committed by the security sector is endless. So their imagination and invention to get away with money is staggering. And so the rent-seeking practices was mentioned, and it is much more than only that. But in many countries, armies, they possess TV stations, banks, airline companies, shopping malls, and these are legitimate activities as opposed to the illegal businesses that they do, so smuggling. But we shouldn't forget also, which is maybe in size of money not so big, but also the police is here also very active, but we call it more retail corruption. It's a small corruption. Every time that you have to cross a roadblock, you have to pay $10. If you have to report a crime, the higher the crime, the more you have to pay, which has hugely also gender ramifications, because those are very heavy crimes, and many times women don't want to dare to come forward with these. Then you have also the issue of ghost armies, that those are soldiers that don't exist, and the salaries are pocketed by their commanders. Or you have on the other side security services, intelligence services whose officials have not been paid for months in a row. I only mention this that it makes really clear that it is necessary that we have to governance this better, and only to give train and equip and give them the goodies and the weapon systems is not enough. It is about the management of these things. And let me give a few examples of how we at DCAF try to contribute to this. And admittedly, this can be much broader also. First of all, with local actors, finance ministries, we do financial diagnosis of the security sector, such as public expenditure review, together with the World Bank and my colleagues at ISAT. In many regions, we set up integrity policies and measures for the police, internal control measures, so a whistleblower system so that people can report these things. But also, and this is very often forgotten or underplayed, or doesn't get enough attention, is the external financial oversight from parliamentary defense committees, parliamentary budget committees, or external audit officers. There we should also work much more on these things. And also, which is very hard and difficult to deal with, we have also to think about strengthening financial oversight of secret service, security service, with a lot of classified information and the so-called dark budget. So there's a lot to be shared on how to deal with these things, and I think we should, with our local partners, pay much more attention to this. Otherwise, it's like cleaning the kitchen with the water tap open. So from train to equip to more a governance-driven approach to security reform and governance. Thank you very much, Daniel. Back to you.
Hans, thank you. That's a lot of information and very relevant stuff within a very short period of time. Thank you. Over to Alex. Alex?
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss these extremely rich and really interesting panels. Listening to this made me think, and the really rich discussion about just a brief anecdote. A long time, many years ago, I was working for USAID, and I was working with the USAID office in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. And I remember having briefings on the justice and security sector reform programs on which I was working, and they talked about the technical aspects of the program and what was happening. And at the end of the conversation, I said, okay, now let's talk about politics, right? So who's connected to who? How do the ministers fit in, right? Who are the different factions and parties? And can we talk about that? And the answer I got was, well, maybe you should go speak to the political section in the embassy. They can tell you about that. That was many years ago, but I think that example is kind of indicative of the disconnect often between the kind of technical programming side in the development world and the political side. And I'm very grateful that the World Bank and the UN are organizing this forum really to try to bridge that gap. And I think it's still extremely important. So let me just make a couple really quick reactions to what we heard today. And I thought there's some really interesting insights, but just a couple of quick takeaways for me. One is that we typically think of political economy analysis of the security sector informing programming in the security sector. But what I really heard today was that it's important not just for the security sector, but for the broader development context and for other program areas, right? And vice versa, right? So the example that Professor Madani was talking about in Sudan, which is the security sector, is the key to broader economic and political development, right? The procurement law example of Egypt, right? This is an area in which the security sector is key, and vice versa, right? So any movement on procurement issue might have a profound impact on the military, right? So these are highly interconnected, and looking at the security sector is important not only for the security sector itself, but for basically areas across development spectrum. The second issue that arose for me was how this points us not only to understanding the actors and interests and networks and resources on the ground, but how external actors, how donors, development donors, security donors fit into this political economy, right? So if we look at, classic political economy, we look at the actors, their interests, what networks they're connected to, the institutions, their resources, right? Oftentimes, outside actors, donors are part of those networks, right? And part of those resources that they need, right? And so we know, looking at the political economy, that any kind of reform is contentious. It's a struggle. There are winners and losers, and outside actors, donors, may play an important and sometimes even decisive role in who comes out on top, right? Who wins and who loses, and what kind of reforms are passed. And again, the example of Egypt that Professor Saif mentioned, I think is illustrative here, and as well as Mali as well, right? Where external assistance has been extremely important in determining who is empowered in society and what groups have greater power than others. But also in my own research, I've also seen where external actors have been decisive in enabling reforms to happen. And so tracing the donor role in those networks, I think, is important. And finally, I think just I think there's some really interesting insights from this discussion on how political economy can be used, right? What do we do with all of this rich knowledge from a security sector reform perspective and from a development perspective? And we typically think of political economy analysis as kind of a filter, right? We have a set of reforms that we want to pass, right? And so we look at, are they feasible or not politically? What are the potential entry points? Who are the potential supporters? And also, what are the effects, right? And so kind of, and we look at that within the security sector, right? Sort of classic example would be, what do we do with the military after a civil war? Do we integrate rebels into it? Do we downsize? Do we restructure? Do we disband, right? And each of those decisions will have major impacts for, what groups are empowered in the post-conflict situation. But I think, and I think that aspect of political economy analysis is critical as a filter as we do programming. But I think what this discussion has pointed to is that political economy analysis can also point us to other connections beyond the security sector. And so how other types of development programs might have a profound impact on the security sector and vice versa. Again, I think the procurement law in Egypt is a really interesting example of this, right? This is kind of a huge issue, and any progress or lack thereof on procurement is going to have a profound impact on the military. Erwin mentioned the example of Libya, right, where there was a huge issue sort of early on in the civil war, and more recently on oil sales, right? And this is an economic issue. It's a macro fiscal issue. It has profound effects on the relative power of the factions, on local level political dynamics, getting to Niagale's point. And so how the economic side of the house deals with this question of oil sales and whether and how they're released and how they're managed has huge impacts on the fragmentation of the security sector, and the ability, and as well as local level security actors and how they integrate with the central state. So again, political economy analysis, I think, is useful as a filter for the security sector, but also as a filter and for examining those broader connections. So that's just, I think, the really kind of interesting points. Obviously, there was a lot more really rich discussion that can be drawn out. But just, again, thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And I look forward to continued discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Hans and Alex, for your informed contributions and reflections on what was just brought up. Maybe we get a few minutes extra, actually, but we do need to leave soon. I take one question from the audience, and then I'll ask one or two panelists to really quickly respond to that. And after that, I hand over to Bernard. Basically, the question from the audience is about the fiscal side of things and the real economy side of political economy. What tools is the question? What tools do we have for understanding the effect of macroeconomic changes on security institutions? For instance, fiscal crises' impact on security institutions' effectiveness. Is that something that anyone feels immediately prompted to say something on? The floor is open. So again, what tools do we have for understanding the effect of changes on security institutions from the macroeconomic side, like fiscal crises' impact on the effectiveness of security institutions? Anyone?
I'm happy to jump in if you wish. I mean, there's no one answer to that. There's no one causal relationship or one indicator you can take that necessarily, results in certain conclusions. What I think is useful to keep in mind here is certainly we're talking about countries for the most part which face enormous challenges. In many cases, large and growing populations with increased demands at a time when central governments have less revenue than ever, often are hollowed out, have minimal administrative capacity, and are trying to, supposed to be stimulating economic activity, investment, innovation, research and development, etc., all the sort of things that allow them to get onto the global, integrating into the global value chain. And for many of the countries we're really looking at and discussing here, many of them are not even on the ladder. So what I want to suggest is that there's different levels to this. One is you've got a broad challenge of security, without which people don't invest. They don't have that predictability that their investment will be protected. But then again, of course, this is not just physical security, because in many cases it's a purely non-coercive or non-physical problem, i.e. that if you operate in a country where knowing the right people or bribing the right people is how you secure contracts, and where displeasing the wrong people can lose you contracts, then that again is a huge disincentive to keeping your money in the country, to investing, to expanding, or to innovating. And we see this, in a country like Egypt, where the net investment, private sector investment in the economy is actually lower today than it was under President Jamal Abdel Nasser in the 1960s, who expropriated and nationalized the entire economy and brought in the socialist decrees. That tells you a lot about the nature of the economy in Egypt, and it tells you that private sector investors who aren't being physically coerced don't feel that it's worth investing in the country. So I think that really depends on what angle you're looking at. If we're talking about actual investment in, say, defense budgets or interior ministry budgets, in employing military and security people, putting them on the payroll, then I think that's a sort of more manageable task. A lot of the time, what that's doing, bluntly, certainly in many Arab countries, is a very inflated payroll with hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of mostly men on the military and or security police payroll, whose skills are very low, whose training is very minimal, whose accountability is next to nothing. and where this is a form of basically dealing with unemployment and providing some basic level of job security and poverty alleviation. So again, how do you measure that in security terms? Well, the good thing is it's keeping men with guns or men off the streets and employing them. On the other hand, is it actually helping with the overall stability of the country and of the economy? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for those reflections, Yazid. Much appreciated. I think from our side, we'll thank all panelists for really fascinating contributions, and I'll hand over to Bernard right away for closing remarks. Bernard.
Yeah, thanks. Look, everybody, this has been a great discussion. We're hitting the hard time limit. So just very briefly, I go to Khaled's opening points about the big wake-up call. Obviously, these kind of discussions are very much around in terms of academia. The development discourse changed in the early 2010s, 2013. There was a number of books coming out, Carruthers, Ben Ramelingham, and others, where aid said, right, it's all very much about power and politics before you start engagement. And I think this conversation reminds us of that. And there are a number of initiatives out there, such as the Thinking Working Politically, the WDR, our own, the World Bank reported to 2017, which are really going to these issues. We're more observers in the security space than practitioners. But I think this conversation is a good wake-up call. And it's still amazing that too often we don't have these really critical discussions that we had today. And I think, as Alex said, this symbiotic relationship, it's not just the security sector, it's also the impact of the economy on the security sector and vice versa. So thanking you. Whether this is a watershed moment, we'll see, but that's somewhat incumbent upon the parties here, the UN and the bank. We do have a work stream on this, and certainly we'll be coming back to those involved and also those who may be interested in the wider audience. Which we'll be looking at how we engage in these very difficult environments, how we don't withdraw, we learn and adapt, and how we can influence positive pathways. So I will end there as my voice gives out, and thanks very much again.
Thank you to everybody. We are ready to sign off, and we'll continue this in other fora and other times and other places. Many thanks. Bye-bye.